Hey, welcome back tuning into today's video. We're going to have a look at the weather for the next 8 to 10 days. In today's video, I think you're going to be in for a more unsettled end to October, as I've been talking about in videos recently. There was a suggestion a couple of days ago that it might bring down some colder air from the north. That's actually gone away, and actually looks like we're going to bring up some fairly mild air from the south through to the end of the month. So it's been a little bit of a shift, but the overall idea is still there, which is for a pretty unsettled end to October. It's been very dry up to this part of the month, but the Atlantic is back now. And I think it'll be staying with us through to the end of the month. Bit of a battleground, though, so it's not a straightforward Atlantic onslaught by any means. We're going to start off having a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Atlantic in terms of this cold blob that we've been hearing a lot about recently, so I'll get on with that in a second. But before I get on with all of that, just to say about the ads, there's links to articles on all the pages at Gas Office, so have a browse widgets and click through the links if there's any articles that you're interested in, and thanks very much for doing that. There's also video ads on most of the pages which open out within the content, and then when you've watched them, they'll close back up again. It's all helping to pay for the website, so thanks very much for doing that. So we've had this cold blob in the North Atlantic for quite a few months, as we know. Been a lot about it in the media, in the papers, on the telly, hearing about how this cold Atlantic sea surface temperature anomaly in the North Atlantic is significant, how it could be leading us potentially into a mini ice age. I've heard that or read that in the papers, but it looks like it's shrinking. So I'm going to start off with the sea surface temperature anomalies for the 21st of September, a month ago. And of course, we know what's going on in the Pacific, got this big El Nino event. I don't particularly want to concentrate on that for this update. This big cold anomaly here, and it was quite a big cold anomaly, it was fairly significant in the North Atlantic through up to September anyway. A big area of below average temperatures in terms of the sea surface temperature anomaly. The latest chart, though, looks like this. So you can see that the cold anomaly is quite clearly shrinking. It has quite clearly shrunk over the past month. So if we go back to September and forwards to now, you see that the cold anomaly is definitely, it's still there to some degree, but it's breaking up. It's starting to become less influential, and it's just generally beginning to dissipate, I think, as the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies begin to push up. Now, it's possible this could start to cool again, but my expectation is that this will continue to warm as we go into next year. We'll probably go into a warmer setup in terms of the North Atlantic. We've got the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation that we have to think about, which is roughly a 30-year cycle of warming and cooling in the North Atlantic. We are in the warm phase of the AMO still. We went into the warm Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation in around 1995. It's a little bit difficult to work out exactly when we went into it, because we had Pinatubo, the volcano, going off in the early 1990s, which dramatically cooled the oceans for a couple of years from 1991 to 1994. So if it hadn't been for Pinatubo, it's possible we would have gone into the cold AMO earlier than sort of 1995. But anyway, sort of mid-1990s was the time when we went into the into the warm AMO. And we're still in the warm Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation region, despite the fact that over the past year or so we've gone cold, or fairly cold with the North Atlantic. The overall setup is still relatively warm and likely to be that way for the next 5-10 years or so. The next cold phase of the AMO, proper cold, which will be sustained over several years, likely sometime in the 2020s, not exactly sure when it will be, but we've certainly got a few more years of the warm AMO to go. So I think what's probably happened with this cold blob that we've had over past years, and it's just signs that the AMO is beginning to start to shift into its colder phase. But as I say, we've got a few years of the warm AMO yet. It's just sort of letting us know, I think, the Atlantic, where it's going to be going over the next 5 or 10 years. But I do think that this cold anomaly is running out of steam now. It certainly isn't the Gulf Stream shutting off. It's certainly not going to be going into an ice age from this cold anomaly. Actually, it's pretty insignificant, to be honest, in terms of what a proper cold AMO looks like. I can show you this chart from March 1985, and that is what a really cold Atlantic Ocean looks like. That was back in the last cold phase of the cold AMO, which was from sort of 1960s through to the early 1990s. That's when we was in the last sort of cold AMO setup, and this is right in the middle of it, this anomaly chart from March 1985, and you can just see how much cold there is in the North Atlantic, and even comparing that to the North Atlantic cold anomaly that it had in September, pretty insignificant, really, that cold anomaly that we had in September compared to what we see back in the proper cold AMO era. So I don't want to sort of negate what happened with the cold blob. It was fairly influential. I think it did help to keep the summer quite cool. We had a very cool September, which was probably mostly down to the cold blob. So it has had an impact on our weather, but I certainly don't think it's signs of a huge climatic shift taking place, and we're already seeing that cold blob is running out of steam. So I would suspect that as we go through the next year or so, we're going to see the Atlantic starting to warm up again as we come to the end of the warm AMO, which it will be the end. It's going to end over the next 5-10 years or so, but I think we'll lift the temperatures up in the Atlantic through the course of next year. Right, I've started off on a bit of a tangent, so let's get back to weather for the next 8 to 10 days, and we're going to start off with the 500 millibar height anomaly charts. We've got the ECMWF on the top, and the GFS is on the bottom. 500 millibars, 8,000 feet is an area in the atmosphere where high pressure, low pressure are being moved around by the jet stream running above. Red extrapolates to high pressure, blue to low pressure. So for the coming week to 10 days, and this takes us up to the end of October, we've got this ridging up to the east and the northeast of the country. Also got a deep trough, though, in the Atlantic. So this is a bit of a battleground situation, really. Jet stream coming in rather like that. And again, with this one, it's going a bit like that. So the Atlantic is trying to attack us. It's trying to give us a bit of an Atlantic onslaught. But this high pressure up to the northeast will absorb some of that energy. But actually, you can get quite a wet spell from these sort of scenarios where you've got high pressure to the northeast and deep troughs of low pressure in the Atlantic. You can get quite active weather fronts kind of stalling over the country. So we may actually be going into a pretty wet end to October. Wouldn't be surprised if we have a great deal of evidence of that at the moment, but these weather fronts, they could be quite active, they could be quite slow moving with that ridge sitting up to the north, but definitely signs of the Atlantic becoming more active, certainly more active than we've had it for quite a long time. The GFS temperature and precipitation ensembles look like this. So quite a few rainfall spikes showing up there, going through the course of next week into the latter stages of October. Not a huge amount coming up for the rest of this week into the weekend. I think we'll bring a band of rain down across the country on Saturday. But other than that, not a great deal until we get through to next week. The temperature ensembles are hovering around average, but they are up and down. So we've got a little bit of a zonal sine wave beginning to set up here. I think we've got a warm sector there, a cold sector there, warm sector there, probably a bit of a cold sector there. Hints of a warmer sector just there, maybe a colder sector there, and then a warmer sector just there. So very gradually, we're probably beginning to see signs of going into more of a westerly, more of a zonal type pattern, with bands of rain coming across the country, warm fronts and cold fronts alternating the air mass, but overall probably not greatly deviating from average, although when you get into November, zonal weather will kind of lift you into above average temperatures, just because of the fact that you tend to get a lack of frost really at night. When the winds are strong, you bring bands of rain through, you tend to limit the frost potential. So although you're roughly even with the warmer sectors and the colder sectors, even when you're in a colder sector, it tends to still be a little bit above average at night, and that's really from November going through into the winter, of course. So just have a look at the generic charts. Here's the GFS for Monday. Very good representation of what we're just looking at from the height anomaly. Really got this deep low pressure in the Atlantic. That could be throwing a weather system into the country with quite wet weather ridging to the east. As we run through the week, this sort of scenario keeps going. So there's all the low pressure in the Atlantic coming to west of the country. There will be bands of rain with those low pressure, but high pressure remains generally across most parts of Europe. So you're seeing between those two masses, the high pressure to the east, the low pressure to the west, there's southerly winds coming up. So it should, if anything, keep the temperature a little bit above average. Particularly mild, I would think, for many central parts of Europe, where we've got some very balmy air coming out of the Mediterranean. We move into the last stages of next week, no real change. High pressure up over Scandinavia, low pressure out in the Atlantic, still throwing those rain bands in across the country. And we go through to day 10, which is Sunday the 1st of November, and just signs that the high pressure over Scandinavia may be starting to win the battle a little bit. But even if it did win the battle and it turned the winds in sort of an east or southeasterly, at least initially those winds would be quite mild, because there's a lot of mild air coming out of North Africa and Mediterranean across most parts of Europe. So it will take a long time, even if the winds go into the east, it will take a long time to start to cool the continent down, because it's generally in quite a warm phase. Actually, I can show you the upper air temperatures with that setup, and you see that most parts of Europe are well above average in those yellow and orange colours. The cold air is restricted around the back of the high to western parts of Russia. Of course, very quickly things can change. It's a continental landmass, so within 2 or 3 days you can go from well above average temperatures to sort of being in the freezer. So it doesn't take a great deal of time to change things around. But even if the wind's going to the east, at least initially, they're likely to be quite mild. The ECMWF looks like this. Again, same idea for the start of next week. Low pressure in the Atlantic, bringing rain bands. High pressure ridging to the east, with winds generally coming from a southerly type direction. We keep that battleground scenario going through the course of the week. And we finish up as we get through into day 10, Sunday the 1st November. Again, just with hints at the high pressure of Scandinavia is possibly starting to win the battle a little bit. This low pressure may be starting to move down towards Biscay and Spain and Portugal. So we may see winds going into the east into the start of November. But I think they'll generally be quite mild easterlies, at least initially. Eventually they might start to bring cooler air in from the far east and northeast of Europe, but it would take quite a few days to really start to cool the continent down. So we're looking at quite a wet end to October, quite an unsettled end to the month, with high pressure to the east, low pressure to the west, bit of a battleground scenario going on. Weather fronts could grind to a halt and give us a very wet spell at some point next week. There's not a great deal of evidence that it's very wet next week, but reading between the lines of models, and sometimes that's what you have to do, sort of interpret them. Somewhere could get a very wet spell, actually, I would think, as we go through next week. So I'll have to keep an eye on that. Beyond that, into the start of November, we might begin to see the high pressure taking over across Scandinavia, turning winds into the east. But initially it would be quite mild and then probably turning colder if those eases were sustained for any length of time. So a lot to digest there. Hope you found the video interesting. And tomorrow we'll be doing JMA Friday, looking at the month ahead with the Japanese and CFS models. That's all for now, and thanks for watching.